Most people think when a man in his late 60s turns away from love, it's because something inside him broke. But what if the truth is something finally healed? Daniel Brooks stared at his phone, the soft glow lighting up the quiet room. Margaret's message still unread, still waiting, still offering something warm, something human, something that, years ago, he would have reached for without hesitation. But tonight was different. Not because he didn't feel the pull, not because he didn't recognize the sincerity behind her words, but because somewhere along the way, after decades of showing up, adjusting, explaining, compromising, and carrying emotional weight he never quite put down, he had discovered something he never knew how to name before. Peace, real peace, the kind that doesn't come from silence alone, but from the absence of tension, the absence of expectation, the absence of having to be anything other than exactly who he is in that moment. And as he sat there, listening to nothing but the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick of a clock on the wall, he realized that this quiet, this stillness, this unremarkable evening with no conflict and no emotional demand felt better than most of the love he had ever experienced. And that realization didn't make him cold, didn't make him distant, didn't make him incapable of love. It made him aware that not everything that feels good at the beginning stays that way, aware that connection can slowly become pressure, and that what most people call withdrawing might actually be the first honest decision a man like him has ever made for himself. From the outside, nothing about Daniel's life looks empty, and that is exactly why people get it wrong. Because when they see a man like him pause before answering a message like Margaret's, they do not see reflection, they see hesitation, they do not see clarity, they see fear, and they fill in the blanks with stories that make sense to them, stories about loneliness, about regret, about a man who must have been hurt too many times. But what they miss is that Daniel is not reacting from a single moment. He is responding from a lifetime of moments stacked, quietly on top of each other, conversations that went nowhere, compromises that slowly turned into expectations, connections that once felt exciting but over time became something heavier, something that required constant attention, constant adjustment, constant energy, and at 67 years old, energy is no longer something he spends casually. It is something he measures, something he protects, something he has learned to value in a way that his younger self never could. And Margaret, even in her kindness, even in her sincerity, represents a question he has already asked himself more times than anyone realizes. Not do I like her, but what will this cost me over time? And that question changes everything. Because when a man begins to think that way, he is no longer chasing connection for the sake of feeling something. He is evaluating whether that connection will preserve the quiet stability he fought decades to build. And for the first time in his life, he is not rushing to answer. There was a time when Daniel did not think this way, a time when he believed that effort could fix almost anything, that patience could smooth over differences, that if he just showed up consistently enough, gave enough, stayed long enough, things would eventually settle into something stable and good. But what life taught him over the years was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet and repetitive, small moments that slowly reshaped how he understood connection, evenings that ended in misunderstandings that never fully resolved, mornings that began with a subtle weight in his chest before a single word was spoken, the feeling of explaining himself over and over again only to realize he was not truly being heard, and none of it looked serious enough in isolation to walk away from. But together it built something heavier than he ever expected, something that followed him long after the conversations ended, long after the relationships themselves had faded, and now, sitting alone in a room that asks nothing from him, Daniel can feel the difference in a way that is impossible to ignore. His breathing is steady, his thoughts are not interrupted, his attention belongs entirely to him. And for the first time in decades, he is not anticipating the next emotional demand, not preparing for the next conversation that might drain him. And that absence of pressure feels unfamiliar at first, almost strange, but then it settles into something deeper, something grounding, and he begins to understand that what he once accepted as a normal part of love was in reality a constant negotiation with his own peace. And now that he has stepped outside of it, Even briefly, he cannot pretend. He does not see the cost anymore. The shift did not happen all at once. It was not a single moment where Daniel decided to choose peace over connection. It was something slower, something almost invisible while it was happening, until one ordinary afternoon made it undeniable. He had spent the day exactly the way he wanted, waking up without an alarm, making breakfast in silence, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee that stayed warm because no one needed his attention, no one interrupted his thoughts, no one pulled him into a conversation he was not ready to have. And somewhere in that quiet routine, something inside him settled in a way it had not in years. Not the kind of temporary relief that fades by evening, but a deeper steadiness, a sense that nothing was about to disrupt him, nothing was waiting around the corner to demand more than he had left to give, and that feeling stayed with him, hour after hour, without effort, without maintenance, without negotiation. And that was when it became clear, not through analysis, but through contrast, that the life he had now felt lighter than the life he used to defend. Because back then, even in good moments, there was always an undercurrent, a need to respond, to manage, to anticipate, to adjust. And now there was none of that, just a quiet consistency that did not ask for anything in return. And once a man experiences that kind of peace, truly experiences it, it stops feeling optional. It becomes the new baseline, the standard by which everything else is measured. And anything that threatens to disturb it, no matter how promising it looks at the beginning, starts to feel less like an opportunity and more like a risk. What Daniel understands now, and what most people never fully see, is that the real danger is not loneliness. It is emotional chaos disguised as connection. Because loneliness, while uncomfortable at times, is predictable. It does not demand explanations. It does not shift without warning. It does not pull you into conversations you are not ready to have. But chaos is different. Chaos comes quietly at first, hidden inside good intentions, inside late-night talks and shared moments. And then, slowly, almost unnoticed, it begins to grow. Expectations form, patterns repeat, tension builds in small, manageable pieces until one day it is no longer small. And by then, stepping away feels more complicated than staying. And Daniel has lived that pattern more than once, enough to recognize it before it fully unfolds, enough to feel the early signs before they become something heavier. And that is why the quiet life he has now feels so valuable. Not because it is perfect, but because it is stable, because it does not change without reason, because it allows him to wake up each day knowing that his emotional state is his own responsibility, not something influenced by another person's mood, another person's expectations, another person's unresolved struggles. And that clarity reshapes everything. Because once a man reaches the point where peace feels more meaningful than excitement, he no longer sees stillness as something missing. He sees it as something protected, something earned. And anything that introduces unpredictability, no matter how appealing it seems in the moment, begins to feel less like a possibility and more like a disruption waiting to happen. Margaret was not the problem. And that was what made it harder to explain, because she was kind in the ways that mattered. She listened without interrupting. She remembered small details about Daniel that most people would overlook. And when she spoke, there was no pressure in her voice, no demand hidden beneath her words, just a quiet sincerity that years ago would have felt rare and worth pursuing. But now, sitting with her message, still waiting on his phone, Daniel understood something that even she could not. See, that it was not about whether she was good or bad for him. It was about who he had become after everything he had lived through, because the man he was in his 30s would have leaned into that connection without hesitation, would have welcomed the possibility of something new, something meaningful, something alive. But the man he is now moves differently, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because he knows that even the most well-intentioned connection can slowly introduce layers of expectation, routines that require adjustment, moments that seem small but accumulate over time. And he has already lived the version of his life where he shaped himself around those layers until he barely recognized his own rhythm anymore. And now that he has rebuilt a life that feels aligned with who he truly is, he cannot ignore how easily that alignment could shift again. Not because Margaret would intend it, but because connection itself carries a weight that he is no longer willing to carry without question, and for the first time, he allows himself to pause instead of stepping forward automatically. Margaret was not the problem, and that was what made it harder to explain because she was kind in the ways that mattered. She listened without interrupting. She remembered small details about Daniel that most people would overlook, and when she spoke, there was no pressure in her voice, no demand hidden beneath her words, just a quiet sincerity that, years ago, would have felt rare and worth pursuing. But now, sitting with her message, still waiting on his phone, Daniel understood something that even she could not see, that it was not about whether she was good or bad for him. It was about who he had become after everything he had lived through, because the man he was in his 30s would have leaned into that connection without hesitation, would have welcomed the possibility of something new, something meaningful, something alive. But the man he is now moves differently, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because he knows that even the most well-intentioned connection can slowly introduce layers of expectation, routines that require adjustment, moments that seem small but accumulate over time. And he has already lived the version of his life where he shaped himself around those layers until he barely recognized his own rhythm anymore. And now that he has rebuilt a life that feels aligned with who he truly is, he cannot ignore how easily that alignment could shift again. Not because Margaret would intend it, but because connection itself carries a weight that he is no longer willing to carry without question. And for the first time, he allows himself to pause instead of stepping forward automatically. By the time a man like Daniel reaches this point, what he wants is no longer complicated. It is not excitement. It is not intensity. And it is certainly not the kind of connection that demands constant emotional adjustment. What he wants is something far simpler and far more difficult to find, a kind of presence that does not disturb the life he has already built, a kind of connection that adds without taking, that exists without slowly reshaping him into someone he had already outgrown. And that is where the real truth begins to surface, because Daniel is not rejecting the idea of love itself. He is rejecting the version of love that requires him to trade his stability for uncertainty, his quiet for noise, his clarity for confusion. And once that distinction becomes clear, everything else starts to fall into place, because it explains why he hesitates even when something feels promising, why he pauses even when someone like Margaret shows genuine care, why he no longer rushes toward what used to feel like opportunity. And the answer is not fear. It is precision. It is a man who has finally learned to separate what looks good from what actually fits into the life he has created. And that level of awareness changes the question entirely, because he is no longer asking whether something could work. He is asking whether it aligns with the version of himself he has spent years becoming. And if the answer is uncertain, even slightly, he does not move forward the way he used to, not because he cannot love, but because he finally understands that love without peace is no longer enough. The message for Margaret is still there, unchanged, waiting in the same quiet way it always has. And Daniel looks at it one more time before gently placing the phone down, not out of indifference, not out of coldness, but out of something far more deliberate, something that took him most of his life to understand, because for years he believed that saying yes was always the right move, that opening the door, taking the chance. Giving someone access to his time and his energy was what life expected of him, but now he sees it differently. Now he understands that every yes carries a weight. Every connection shapes the rhythm of his days. And at this stage, that rhythm matters more than the possibility of something new. And what makes this moment so difficult to explain to anyone watching from the outside is that nothing is obviously wrong. There's no conflict, no betrayal, no clear reason to step back, and yet the decision feels right. Not because it is easy, but because it is aligned.